Cecilia. I'm director of the Princeton Environmental Institute. On behalf of our institute and our co-sponsors of this afternoon's talk, which are the Center for Contemporary China and the Center for Policy, Research, and Energy and Environment, CPRE, in the Woodrow Wilson School, we'd all like to welcome you this afternoon. It's great to see so many of you here when we're competing with the fantastic weather day, so it's great to see you here in DO10. I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker for this afternoon, Barbara Finamore. She's a leading expert on China's environment and environmental policy. She has nearly 4 decades of experience in environmental law and energy policy and has focused on China for more than 25 years. She's currently the Senior Strategic Director for Asia at the Natural Resources Defense Council, NRDC, and also leads NRDC's Green Ports project in China, which aims to reduce air pollution caused by shipping and port-related activity. Among many things, in 1996, she founded NRDC's China program, focusing on climate, clean energy, environmental protection, and urban solutions. This was the first clean energy program to be launched by an international NGO. In 2017, Barbara was named as a member of a group that's called the U.S China 50, a group of 50 individuals who are working on the relationship between China and the U.S. In what we understand to be a quite complex and difficult time. She's also the co-founder and president of the China-U.S. Energy Efficiency Alliance. Before joining the NRDC, Barbara worked for the United Nations Development Program, the Center for International Environmental Law, and the U.S. Departments of Justice and Interior. She's also served as president and chair of the Professional Association for China's Environment. She holds a JD degree with honors from Harvard Law School. Her recent book, Will China Save the Planet? There it is, and there are others up here if you're interested. Addresses the issue of, now that the U.S. has in many ways abdicated a leadership role on environment under the current administration, will China take the lead to fill in that void that has been left, and what will they do? I think it's a question that many of us are very much interested in, and are looking forward to what Barbara gives us as an answer to that question. So please join me in welcoming today's speaker, Barbara Finamore.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you to the Princeton Environmental Institute, and thank you all for being here on Earth Week. And I'm delighted to be sharing it with you. We are living in a new era. We are at the cusp of a transformation in our global energy system that is as profound as the switch from biomass to fossil fuels 2 centuries ago. But we are also living in an era of rapidly accelerating climate change. And according to the latest reports from the UN climate scientists, the IPCC, we must act now to cut our GHG greenhouse gas emissions in half by 2030 if we are going to reduce the catastrophic impacts of climate change to what they call mostly survivable levels. And in order to do so, we need to dramatically shift away from fossil fuels and transform our global economy at a speed and a scale that have no documented historic precedent. So how do these 2 major transformations intersect? Can we move fast enough to make the transition to clean energy in a way that is going to preserve our climate? We are sitting at a crossroads right now, and right in the center of that crossroads is China. So when I first moved to China in 1990, winter meant coal. this is what I saw out of my window. And every year on November 15th, regardless of the weather, the government of Beijing and many other northern Chinese cities would turn on the heat. And instantly, the skies would darken and our faces would become covered with soot. And when I, again, looked down the street, I would see bicycles, many of which were carrying loads of loose coal to their people's homes for use in heating and cooling. And in Beijing at that time, there were 4 large coal-fired power plants within city limits, as well as the largest steel mill in China. Now, all of that is gone now, but China's reliance on coal remains. A year after I moved to China, I witnessed the emergence of China on the international climate negotiation stage. The premier at the time, Li Peng, had invited ministers from 40 developing countries to Beijing to develop a joint strategy for negotiating the Framework Convention on Climate Change. And many of the principles of that meeting in Beijing found their way into this Framework Convention on Climate Change. Most notably, the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities for developed and developing countries based on respective capabilities. And that principle, many claim, was the reason why Premier Wen Jiabao was widely blamed for the failure of world leaders to reach a global climate treaty in 2009 in Copenhagen. Yet only a few years later, in Paris, China played a very constructive role, along with the other of the world's 2 largest emitters, the United States, in developing a series of bilateral agreements that really built the momentum for the global Paris Climate Agreement and hastened the speed with which it entered into force. Here are China's climate pledges in Paris. Some say they were unprecedented. No one expected China ever to agree to peak its CO2 emissions. So what changed between Copenhagen and Paris? And now that the United States has, at least the Trump administration, has abdicated its role in climate leadership, is China stepping up? The answer to that, as I explain in my book, requires an understanding of the complex economic and political realities that China operates under, the fundamental obstacles that it faces, and the many and powerful vested interests that are resisting change. But one thing is clear: China is uniquely positioned to catalyze the speed and the scale of the global energy transformation. It is doing so in some respects, and in others, it is yet to come. So I will explain that with respect to 4 key issues: coal, renewable energy, electric vehicles, and China's massive infrastructure investment program around the world, the Belt and Road Initiative. So in 2006, China overtook the dubious honor of overtaking the U.S. as the largest annual emitter of CO2. Though it's important to note that even to this day, China's per capita emissions are less than half those of us in the United States. And even the cumulative emissions of China lag far behind ours, though China is catching up rapidly. And the reason for that is coal. Many of you may have seen the famous CO2 hockey stick, the global hockey stick that shows how CO2 emissions have jumped up. Well, this goes a long way to explaining why. And it began here in the early 2000s, soon after China joined the WTO and entered into one of the fastest growing economic decades that the world had ever seen. During those years, China quadrupled its GDP, it nearly quintupled its exports, and it tripled its coal consumption as it became the manufacturing center of the world. But China, in the past couple of years, has changed that trajectory and began to reduce, or at least initially level off, its coal consumption. Does anyone know why? Anyone wish to venture a guess?
Nuclear development.
You know, not really, because even though China has made nuclear power a strategic industry, it still provides only a very small percentage of China's energy mix. Yes?
Complaints about the air quality?
Yes, yes. Beginning in the late 2000s, China began to recognize that its development model that focused on export-led heavy manufacturing powered by coal was no longer enough, even as it continued to grow GDP, in guaranteeing a high quality of life for its citizens, and that it was leaving a trail of environmental degradation in its wake. And the tipping point came in 2013, the year many called the Eir Pocalypse. Have you heard of the Eir Pocalypse? This was the time when the air quality in China became worse than, say, living in an airport smoking lounge, or even worse than the air quality in some of the California fires of last year. People wore face masks to go outside. Hospital admissions soared, and studies showed that an average of 4,000 people were dying every day from air pollution. That's equivalent to having every man, woman, and child in China smoke 1.5 cigarettes every hour. So public concern, as you can imagine, soared. And by the end of that year, China had enacted a national air pollution control and action plan focused on cutting coal consumption in its most polluted regions, and allocated 1.7 trillion renminbi, and took a whole raft of other measures designed to move it away from coal. And so the results were impressive. Starting in 2013, coal use stabilized in China, and then it dropped for the next 3 years. And why is this important? Because as a result, China's CO2 emissions dropped and global CO2 emissions stabilized. Because China is responsible for about 1/3 of global CO2 emissions, and most of that is from coal. But it's not as easy as you might think to switch the world's second largest economy away from one that was built on coal. And in fact, the last 2 years, China's coal use and its CO2 emissions have begun to rise again, though not nearly as high as they were during that 2013-2014 peak. And the reasons for that, primarily because the economy has been slowing down in China, not just because of the U.S. China trade wars, but slowing down in general, as is typical for countries after a certain period of time. But the government has been injecting an economic stimulus again, like it has done in the past, to keep the economy running. That means more infrastructure development, which means more coal, iron, and steel production, which means more coal-fired power emissions. Also, local governments have been discovered to continue to build coal-fired power plants, even as the government has told them to shut down, because, again, they rely on the jobs, they rely on the tax revenue, and so forth. But the important thing so the question on everybody's mind, is this a blip or a trend? Is this a bump in the road of China's low-carbon transition, or are we going to see the levels of CO2 emissions we saw before? I think the key message to keep in mind here is that many analysts, including the International Energy Agency, have discovered and come to the conclusion that none of these new coal plants are needed in China, because many of the existing coal plants are only being run half of the time, because the prices of renewable energy is dropping so fast that coal is not rapidly becoming uncompetitive cost-wise with these cleaner energy sources, even if you don't consider the high cost of dealing with the air pollution and other environmental costs. In fact, some studies show that China risks ending up with billions of dollars, some say as high as $490 billion. That's almost $500 billion worth of what they call stranded assets. These coal plants will never be able to recover their investments. So we shall see. We shall see what happens with the coal plants. Many coal plants around the world are already being shut down. And I believe that this is an inexorable movement away from a 19th century technology. But what does China need to do in order to get back on track to its plans to transition away from coal? Here are some of the things that we, NRDC, are working on in China with the Chinese government, with businesses, with other stakeholders. And one of them, I just want to point out here, is to complete power sector reform. Because the rules of the game were written, the rules of the grid system were written at a time when China was trying to build as many new coal plants as possible to fuel its economic development. So the rules, in many cases, still exist to put coal in the driver's seat, guarantee a certain amount of hours, a certain amount of cost, regardless of the existence of cleaner and cheaper alternatives. So that is the order of the day for China, to carry out some very, very difficult political, economic, and technological transitions. But the good news is there are much better alternatives out there. And I want to start off with this one because I want to ask you, which do you think is the cheapest, cleanest, fastest source of energy for China? Or in fact, for any country? Anyone wish to hazard a guess? Very good. Energy efficiency. Instead of the megawatts that are provided by every other energy source, we call these negawatts, the energy that you don't produce. The fact of the matter is China has made great strides in energy efficiency over the last 2 decades. The IEA says that it's a global efficiency powerhouse. But the amount of energy China uses to produce 1 unit of GDP is still much higher than the world average. So there are still enormous opportunities in buildings. China is the world's largest building construction site, and in industry, large, small, and medium, to retrofit and to build new facilities in a way that will use energy more productively. But China has also recognized that wind and solar power and other renewable energy are the largest market opportunity of the 21st century. And you can see it as a factor of their investment. So again, that same year of the Eir Pocalypse was the year that China overtook every other country as a leading investor in renewable energy. And last year, for example, for every dollar that the U.S. invested, China invested 2. And it is continuing this massive, massive production. And the solar energy is a particularly exciting story because just 10 years ago, a little over 10 years ago, China was already the leading exporter, producer and exporter of solar panels in the world, mostly exported to Europe. But when the 2008 financial crisis hit, most of its recipients, its buyers, dropped their subsidies for solar energy, and the market dropped out of China's export market. And that's when China decided that it needed to build up its own domestic market through a series of measures, all wrapped up into a specific 5-year plan just for solar power as a strategic industry. Feed-in tariffs, subsidies, R&D, targets for reducing costs, increasing quality, and innovation. And within 5 years of that financial crisis, China had dropped the cost of solar energy worldwide by 80%. And in the last 5 years since then, it's dropped by another 2/3, and it's continuing to drop. And China, in 2017, installed as much solar power domestically as existed in the entire world in 2014. What's happening here is that these price drops and this massive investment and policy support, financial support, are bringing the solar industry and the wind industry to a point where it will soon become cost competitive to build new solar and wind plants, or even cheaper than to buy the coal for operating existing coal plants. So that's the energy transition that China is catalyzing. So China now owns, China has more solar energy capacity as by next year, China will have 4 times the solar energy capacity of the United States. And it all happened so fast. And then it also has 1 out of every 3 wind turbines in the world, which reminds me of a Chinese proverb: when the winds of change blow, some people build walls and others build windmills. So this picture to me epitomizes that global energy transition that I'm talking about. This is in Anhui province a couple of years ago. China built the world's largest floating solar power plant, and it's on top of a collapsed coal mine. But I couldn't resist showing you this next one. But despite everything I've said about the rapid growth of renewable energy, we still live in a world that is 2/3 fossil fuel. But because of China's massive policy support, financial support, and global impact, experts say that we're at a point where we could reach 50% renewables by 2050. But those UN climate scientists tell us that is nowhere near enough. That in order to avoid the worst catastrophic climate change, we need to get the world to 85% renewables by 2050. So a long way to go. And here are some of the challenges that China faces. Some of them are geographic because the solar and wind resources are predominantly in the northwest of the country, far away from the demand centers and population centers in the east. Some of them are economic. China built so much solar power that it is facing a $15 billion deficit in its renewable energy fund. It can no longer pay the subsidies. So just last year, it decided to phase them out, and now it says it will not approve any new solar or wind plants unless they are cost competitive with coal. And as I said before, we are rapidly approaching that point. But what China is doing to help that transition is to set up a new quota system for every province, how much renewable energy it has to either generate or buy renewable energy credits for from other provinces. And as I said before, politically, maybe the most difficult change is how to reform the power sector so that renewable energy can compete on the grid on a level playing field with coal. But coal is a powerful incumbent. Electric vehicles, also extremely important, because even though I've just talked about coal, China's oil consumption is growing at a rapid rate. And some say it is adding the equivalent in demand every year of a medium-sized country. And So one of the reasons is now China is the world's largest auto market. The love affair with cars in China reminds me a lot of what it's been like here in the United States. But China is taking action. Again, it has declared electric vehicles to be a strategic industry, largely due to the advocacy of one man who I met back in 2010 when he was just returning to his native Shanghai from working in Germany with Audi. And he had a vision of how China could leapfrog the internal combustion engine. Even though China had no real expertise in building cars, the U.S. built the first practical electric car, invented the solar cell, and could have this leadership position. But we have squandered it while China has moved ahead through, again, a whole raft of issues, approaches, ranging from massive subsidies, $60 billion between 2015 and 2020, non-financial benefits for car owners, such as the fact that if you buy an electric vehicle in some of the major cities, you don't have to enter a lottery or wait years to get a license plate. R&D, targets again for innovation. And frankly, a lot of requirements designed to freeze out the rest of the world's automakers. And this is one of the targets of the talks on U.S. China trade. And I think China is beginning to open up its industry to foreign automakers. But in the meantime, China now owns, or at least as of last year, 40% of the world's electric vehicles. And it added another million last year. It plans to have 7 million electric vehicles on the road by 2025. And even more important, it has already cornered the market for electric buses with 99% of the world's electric buses. It has 50% of the world's charging stations. These statistics go on and on. But the important thing to recognize is, again, just like with solar energy, China's investment, whether it be through policy, through technologies, through financial investments in electric vehicles, and particularly in batteries, which are about 1/3 of the cost of electric cars, it has brought the cost of electric vehicles down so substantially that it's, according to some experts, it'll be as cheap to buy an electric vehicle as a traditional internal combustion engine car within 8 to 10 years. That's, again, part of the global energy transition. But despite the rapid growth, we're still at just the beginning of this transition. Only 4.6% of the global car fleet, which when I wrote the book was half that. So it's growing fast, but nowhere near where we need to be. But given China's leadership on electric vehicles, some people say we could get to 50% electric vehicles by 2050. But is that enough? No, of course not. The UN scientists say we need to have all transportation, 65% of all transportation, be low or zero carbon by 2050. So again, we're just at the beginning of all of this. And China faces severe challenges in moving to the next stage of accelerating the growth of electric vehicles. Here are just some of the barriers that it faces. And I do believe that many of these barriers are common to those we face here in the United States, the other huge vehicle market, and that the only real way to overcome these is for the two countries to work together, as they did for many years under the Obama administration, under something called the Climate Change Working Group, to develop joint markets, joint standards, to give a really strong, unmistakable signal to the private sector that this is the way the industry is going, so that they will make the necessary investments. But in the meantime, China is also facing the need to shift away from heavily subsidizing electric vehicles, especially as the cost goes down. And as I said before, we're not quite at the point where electric vehicles can compete on cost with your typical car. So what China's doing in the meantime is pretty amazing. Last September, it issued a new policy called the dual credit policy, or the new electric vehicle policy, based on California's zero emission vehicle standard. So what they said is, starting this year, any of the world's large vehicle manufacturers who want to sell a vehicle of any kind in China have to meet a certain quota, which I think is something about 10%. It's a complicated system. 10% this year, going up to 12% next year, of the clean electric vehicles. And because they're the world's largest market, that simple announcement triggered a wave of announcements from every major automaker of new investments, which may total up to $300 billion in total in the next 5 years. New electric vehicle models and lines, joint ventures with Chinese companies, and so forth. So here's another area where China has done more than anybody else to catalyze the growth of this very important clean energy technology. And finally, I just wanted to talk a moment about the Belt and Road Initiative, which is China's massive infrastructure investment plan, which it launched, oddly enough, also in 2013. Some estimates are this is investment in about 70 countries worldwide so far that comprise 2/3 of the world's population and about 60% of the world's CO2 emissions. And China's financing transportation, infrastructure, power infrastructure, ports, to improve connectivity, ensure new markets for Chinese goods, and so forth. So here is a golden opportunity for China to share its expertise, its technologies, its experience with renewable energy policies in order to help these Belt and Road recipient countries with their low carbon transitions. But unfortunately, to date, most of China's investments have been in fossil fuel overseas, fossil fuel infrastructure. And some people say it's because China, as it is cutting back on fossil fuels domestically, it wants to outsource and ensure markets for its own fossil fuel industry. And indeed, it is also exporting a tremendous amount of renewable energy overseas. But most of that, as you can see, is by the black. These are state policy banks, but also private sector investors are responding to market signals, and they're the ones that are financing renewable energy overseas, whereas it's the state policy banks that are, by and large, financing the outdated technology, the dirty technologies. And it's interesting enough that tomorrow is the date when China is hosting its second annual Belt and Road Forum. And it has invited world leaders from 47 countries to attend. And from what we're hearing, China may be responding to these concerns that if it doesn't green the Belt and Road Initiative more than it's already doing, it is helping these recipient countries lock in CO2 emissions for decades to come. But it doesn't have to be. One recent study by the World Resources Institute of 31 Belt and Road recipient countries looking at their Paris climate pledges, also called NDCs, or nationally determined contributions, they found that almost $400 billion would be needed for these 31 countries alone, that's not even half the recipient countries, to meet the renewable energy commitments that they made in the Paris Agreement. So here are some of the things that China can do in order to green the Belt and Road. And the first one would be this one. Use those nationally determined contributions from the recipient countries as a template for making its own investment decisions. And then help these countries develop the kind of policies and infrastructures and transmissions that they need in order to take advantage of that renewable energy. But energy efficiency, as always. But the recipient countries can do a lot as well. And again, many of those countries, their own Paris pledges are not detailed or quantitative enough to serve as that template. Luckily, this year, by the end of this year, every country has agreed at the next round of climate negotiations, they are going to announce new and more ambitious climate targets. So here's an opportunity for them to make them specific so that they can really serve as a basis for investment decisions. So in closing, I just wanted to show you this picture. These are two pictures, actually, taken from the window of my Beijing office, just 3 days apart. And to me, this symbolizes China at a crossroads. The decisions that it makes now, going forward, on everything I mentioned, from power sector reform, from making that economic transition away from subsidies, Belt and Road, that will determine whether China moves in backwards direction to where it has been during its economic growth years, or whether it can find a new path towards slower but higher quality growth, as the government has said it wants to do. And here are some of the people working with China to help it overcome those obstacles that I've described. These are my colleagues in my Beijing office that I founded in 1996. For many years, our Beijing office, I used to joke, was one man with a cell phone. But now we have almost 50 people in China working hand in hand with government, with NGO partners, with companies, with research institutes, in order to help China cap its coal consumption, cap its oil consumption, green its Belt and Road initiative, achieve low-carbon urbanization, deep power sector reform, energy efficiency, and so forth. And I'm very proud of them. So by this time, you are probably wondering, so will China save the planet? And I can't help but take this opportunity to say, well, just read my book and find out. But time is running out. And regardless of the answer, there is room and there is pressing need for every country to step up its ambition and its efforts to protect our planet. And not just countries, every state, every province, every business, every investor, and every individual. Because the message from these latest UN climate reports is clear, that every year matters, every degree of warming matters, every action matters, every choice matters, and every person matters. So I hope you will join with me and with NRDC to help fight for the future of our planet. And once again, happy Earth Week. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We have time for questions, so we'll take questions from the audience. In the back.
My understanding is that to be effective, women and women solar need to be married for good energy storage.
Thank you for mentioning that. I meant to discuss this. It's absolutely essential. You really can't compare renewable energy with coal plants or with nuclear. unless you include energy storage systems, because otherwise you can only use wind and solar when the wind is blowing and the sun is shining. And here, once again, China understands the need to improve and drastically bring down the price of energy storage such that it can be a real solution. And they're doing it, just like they are with wind and with solar itself and with electric vehicles. Many of you have heard that Tesla is building a battery factory for electric vehicles. Well, China is building not just gigafactories for energy storage, but giga cities. There's 20 large cities that China's building where they are just building new energy storage technologies. And that, once again, is bringing the price down, not just for electric vehicles, but for wind and solar. So, again, we are nearing the point in the near future where it will be cheaper to build new wind and solar plants coupled with energy storage than to continue to run coal plants. That's the real apples to apples comparison, and China is working on it.
Actually, I will ask you two political science questions. One has to do with China, one has to do with the U.S. China has multiple goals, the government has at least. One is to actually, the new government has focused on improving environment, a big agenda. But on the other hand, it has also tightened control, especially of foreign organizations, NGOs, and so on. So has your organization encountered difficulties, even though your work tries to improve the environment in China? It's good for China. Organizations like yours, they have difficulties in the current government. Secondly, the U.S. also has changed. The whole country, academic, media have turned negative towards China. And you've written a book that's pretty favorable of China, Chinese government. Have you faced criticisms from American academics and politicians and journalists?
Yeah, both very good questions. So for those of you who may not know it, China has put into place a new foreign organization law that requires pretty much all non-government organizations that are not Chinese to register if they're going to conduct substantial activities in China or have an office there like we do. So like all the others, we have had to comply. And the first step required finding a Chinese government organization willing to sponsor us. And, you know, we're in a situation now in China, I think, of increased cautiousness on the part of government officials, not just in sponsoring foreign NGOs, but in every area. As the central government control continues, everybody's concerned. So yes, it took us quite a while to find a government organization willing to sponsor us. And during that time, it was very difficult for us to do anything. But we have done so. We have registered. And it's a whole new ballgame now. We have to give the government a plan every year, at the end of every year, of what our activities are intended to be during the coming year, and then report back on how well we've done those the other time. So, we've never had to do that before, and that is a chilling effect, because it reduces our ability to respond to new opportunities as they arise. We have to list our partners to respond to new partners. So yes, this is not how we operate anywhere else. We're an independent NGO. We always have been, and we will continue to be so. But it's been a difficult transition for everybody, I think. And then your other question, remind me again. U.S. reaction. Yes, the biggest criticism I've gotten of my book is about the title. Will China save the planet? Because many people read that to imply an answer of yes, which I'm not giving it away. But anyway, And I just have to say, where did that come from? I did not choose the title. This was my publisher, who actually approached me, a publisher in London, approached me to write this book as part of an environmental series in which every book has a provocative question title. So they insisted on it. So in case you're wondering.
We have 3 questions here, 1, 2, and 3.
I'm just curious, with Amory Levin's Rocky Mountain Institute also trying to work in China, how successful have they been, and to what extent do we collaborate with one another?
Yes. They entered the scene just a few years ago. We've been there for over 20 years, like I said, but we do work closely with them. And with Amory Levins, who I'm sure you know is an absolute visionary, I actually invited him on his first trip to China, which was back in 2000, when we held the first conference on fuel cell vehicles in China, which is what that fellow I showed you, Wang Gan, was trying to build. Anyway, what they have done is really kind of big roadmaps for China, including what they call reinventing fire. They did one in the U.S. to show how can the U.S. move to a system that's predominantly renewables, and then they did a similar one for China. Whereas we're more the on-the-ground advocates, implementers, helping with enforcement, and also legal. NRDC was founded by a group of lawyers. So I think our expertise meshes very well, and we do work closely together. Thank you. Yes?
Thank you. I have a question for the figure you were showing about where commercial banks finance more, the majority of the renewable energy on the Belt and Road Initiative. So I wonder, what does that mean? And also, why do you think it is the case? Does that mean overall in the recipient countries, renewable energy has become more attractive in terms of profit for the banks? Because presumably we think usually the commercial banks make profit, whereas the policy banks have certain policy burdens from the government. So I wonder, what does it mean, and why do you think that to be?
Yes, yes. It's an interesting question. I think one of the reasons that the Chinese banks are financing coal is that so many other banks, multilateral banks, country banks around the world are restricting their investment in coal plants. And this is a very exciting trend, because one recent report says that just about every 2 weeks we get another announcement from a bank around the world that they are limiting their investments in coal and other fossil fuels. So here's an opportunity, I think, for China to step up. They say they're only responding to the need, the expressed desire of countries who, I think in many cases, still think that coal is the cheapest power option. But I think also it's a package. These state-owned enterprises are the ones financing the coal plants overseas, and it's the Chinese companies that are signing the contract to build them. And in many cases, the Chinese entities are co-owners of them. And so it's almost as if China is subsidizing the fossil fuel infrastructure in these recipient countries. Because without that kind of support, I think the market signals would be much clearer, as I've said before, that renewable energy is the way to go. So, and again, like I said before, I think with policy banks, they're not concerned so much about making a profit, but they're responding to government initiative here. And even though I should say that the Chinese government has developed a whole series of guidelines for investment, for green investment in overseas, including in the Belt and Road. But to date, most of that guidance is not mandatory. It's voluntary. So it is not honored as well as it could be. So the next step really is to move towards more rigorous environmental standards. And we have been asked to join, actually, one of 10 groups that is being set up to help green the Belt and Road Initiative in various ways. And we're in the group that's involved in preparing more rigorous environmental regulations and standards. So I hope that will start to change.
I'm Denise Melville, and I want to thank you for an excellent talk.
Thank you.
Great overview of really important issues. I want to follow up on Ben's question in the context of what you said about reading the BRI, because the impression that we've been getting recently is that a lot of the coal that technology that's being built in developing countries by China is by the request of the recipient countries. We've been trying to understand how much of what's going on is by China pushing this technology out versus the recipient countries pulling it in.
Right.
And it seems like the recipient countries' requests are really important. So my question to you is, where do you see opportunities to leverage that so that their requests can be shifted? Is it like capacity building in the developing countries?
Yeah.
Is it policies within China? Where are the leverage points to shift from coal to renewables?
Right, right. You know, that's right. China says it's responding to the desires and requests of the recipient countries, but the fact of the matter is the whole process of the Belt and Road is not very transparent. And it's very difficult to answer your question of whether this is a push or a pull. And that's why I said I think there's work that can be done both within China to help set those standards, including, you know, using the Paris pledges as a framework, and then getting the recipient countries to tighten up their framework. But also, like I said before, they often, it's just like China was not that long ago. It didn't have the capacity. It didn't have the policies in place. It doesn't have always the transmission lines in place to get renewable energy into the grid. All of the problems that China has had to address over the last decade or so are ones that these countries face. So you could understand why perhaps in some of them they see coal plants as the obvious answer. So yes, capacity building in the recipient countries, development of those kind of standards and policies and technologies are all needed. And that's why I keep saying China is in a position to offer that, rather than just, here we know how to build coal-fired power plants. They also know how to make a renewable energy system work.
We go to this side of the room.
Great, thank you. Thank you for your talk. Two quick questions. One of the things that I have read is that China is one of the most vulnerable countries to climate change, and that it has almost the most emissions inside of India. Is that recognition coming to fruition within both the policy leaders as well as the population, and is that going to place any political pressure to continue on this route a little bit quicker in the future?
Yes.
And the second is, I'd love to know what's going on in nuclear, and also I saw they were investing in fusion in a very good way. Could you kind of add that into?
Yes, yes. That's in fact true. China, studies have shown not just the international scientists, but China's own scientists have done extensive studies, and most recently a 700-page report by Chinese scientists that underscore that China is extremely vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And I think that's the type of report that matters more to China than the international climate scientists, although they've participated in all of those reports drafting as well. And the impacts range from the fact that of the 3 cities in the world that are most vulnerable to sea level rise, 2 are in China, or 3 of the 5 if you include Hong Kong. And these are highly populated, one of the most highly populated cities in the world. So Shanghai's already moving towards adaptation. They've developed a whole system for that, but they can't build walls in Shanghai like they can in New York City, for example, just because of the groundwater system. So, and China's already very water poor, and climate change is already exacerbating that. The glacial melts are causing severe problems, severe weather events, just the whole range of things. They've already understood that. And the public understands it too. According to a couple of surveys that have been done recently, the public understands that climate change is real, that it's happening now, that it's caused by human activity, and that something has to be done. And I credit that with the fact perhaps that the state-owned media doesn't feel the need to present on the one hand, on the other hand, and find 1 or 2 climate scientists, climate deniers, to counter the vast majority who say all those things. But on the other hand, in terms of political pressure, two things. One is that people care much more about air pollution. You know, there was a study, I talked about the Eir Pocalypse 5 years ago. Well, there was a study that came out 2 weeks ago by a group, U.S. group, called the Health Effects Institute that analyzes the global burden of disease from air pollution. And in China and India still, 1.2 million premature deaths every year from air pollution. That's not far below the level of the Eir Pocalypse. People, and you can see it, that picture I showed you a couple of slides ago. That's what they care about, more than climate change, because it's real and it's happening, and children are most vulnerable, and people still don't have too many children in China. So political pressure, not so much. And actually, in the survey, most people believed that the government was handling it. So they don't feel the need to push, like we do here in the US, for more government action. Oh, nuclear. Okay. Yes, and you asked about nuclear earlier. So nuclear power, again, during the period when China's economic growth was outstripping its ability to build coal-fired power plants, China made nuclear power a strategic industry and started building plants, and at that time had very ambitious plans for how many nuclear plants it planned to build. And then the Fukushima accident happened, and right in their neighborhood. And I was there at the time, and the public outcry, I think, really set the government back. They immediately halted all approvals of new nuclear plants, and they halted construction of all those while they conducted a safety review. And my organization, actually, after Fukushima, shortly after, we held a nuclear safety conference in China, the first one ever. And the Chinese officials who participated kind of admitted that nuclear safety was not, the system for nuclear safety was not really in place in China. And so there was a big debate within the government about what to do. And what China ended up doing was deciding, number one, they were not going to build any new nuclear plants inland where there's a higher earthquake risk, and also lack of sufficient water, because nuclear plants need a lot of water. That leaves the plants to be built in the highly populated eastern seaboard. But China also decided that it would not proceed with construction of any of the plants based on older technology, that they would only move to newer, safer technologies. So that has slowed down their plans. They've pretty much cut in half. Well, that's not true. There's a whole range here of estimates now of how many plants China might build. I think there's been no real decision by the government on what it's going to do. And part of the problem is that as it moves towards a system, towards new technologies that are safer, they are more expensive. And nuclear already is much more expensive than just about any other form of energy in China. And as China's moving away from subsidies in all the other technologies and is moving towards power sector reform that's going to allow more competition among energy sources, that poses a risk to nuclear power. And so there's also a political risk, because unlike the situation in Japan, where the public outrage was directed at the utility, the government's concerned about the political risk if there were to be an accident in China, that the government would be blamed. And so they're proceeding very, very cautiously right now. But they are leading the world in R&D on every kind of advanced form of nuclear power, fusion, fission. I mean, their basic view is any kind of energy option other than coal they want to explore. And so they're trying to do that in a situation where every other country is stepping back.
Do you have some insights on China's past and potential use of so-called natural climate solutions such as reforestation and changes in agricultural practices as a way to further diminish its carbon footprint?
Yes, yes. Actually, there was an article in, I think, Nature magazine just recently that found that China is one of the world leaders in reforestation. It's been planting forests at an astounding rate. And part of that is not just because of climate, of course, but because of rapidly advancing desertification. And the urbanization that has, led to a lot of loss of arable land and forest systems. So yes, they are. That's one of their climate pledges I posted at the beginning, and they are well on their way to achieving that. And I expect that when they announce their new climate pledges the end of this year, we should probably see another deeper forestation pledge. Agricultural practices too. They have a very comprehensive climate change plan that covers everything you could think of, including new agricultural practices, including population control, and so forth. They've also called on the population of China to eat less meat, because as China becomes more prosperous, they are eating much more meat than ever before, with obvious climate implications. So, but I don't think that's gone very far. But yes, so I only focus on a few things, but there's many more areas that China is moving ahead on.
Well, join me please in thanking Barbara again for this.
Thank you very much. Thank you again, Michael. Thank you so much.
We're going to stay another half hour with questions.
Yeah.